Hello, welcome to Education for the 21st Century. We are a podcast/vodcast. We're brought to you by the College of Education here at Lehigh University, and we represent the Educational Leadership Program. We focus on various issues going on in U.S. education. We bring attention to things such as educational leadership, school and community, innovation in education, research to practice, social and cultural dynamics in schools, and we bring together various experts to discuss various challenges and solutions. Today, we are pleased to have with us Dr. Kaitlin Anderson, who is a new faculty member in the College of Education, the Program of Educational Leadership, which is our educational home here at Lehigh University. So we certainly want to welcome Dr. Anderson to the monthly podcast. And as always, my co-host, Tashina Kabaz.
Hi there. Dr. Anderson's research focuses on issues of equity and opportunity in educational organizations. Specifically, she evaluates local and state policies, primarily using administrative data. Much of her work has focused on assessing discipline disproportionalities for underrepresented groups and the impact of discipline policies on important student outcomes. Dr. Anderson also has interests in school choice policies and teacher labor market reforms, particularly in understanding how these policies impact students and their access to high-quality teachers and schools. Ultimately, she is interested in how policy may serve to advance or undermine equity in schools and aim to conduct research that enables educational leaders and policymakers to make equity-driven and evidence-based decisions. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me to you both. This is great.
Excellent. So what first got you interested in educational policy and leadership?
Great question. So I was teaching high school math in a small town in Arkansas, and while I really loved a lot of the aspects of that job, it also was sort of eye-opening in the sense that I started to notice some policy or institutional, social, political, funding-based factors that were really making it difficult to do a good job as a teacher, but also clearly not providing a lot of students with the opportunities and education that they deserve. So for example, we had a really hard time recruiting teachers, particularly for math and science at the high school level. We also, there were pretty clear disparities in terms of student discipline, for example, or access to advanced coursework, those kinds of things that I was starting to notice. And it really got me interested in learning more about how we got to that point, and also what are some of the policy levers or practices that educational leaders could do to address some of those inequities that I was seeing in the system.
Oh, okay. So is this what led you to University of Arkansas?
Yes. So then I ultimately chose to pursue an education policy degree at the University of Arkansas, where I was still able to do really relevant policy-related work in service of the state there. And one of their key things that the state was focused on at that time was disproportionalities in student discipline. And so it was a really great opportunity for me to focus on that as part of my dissertation and ultimately a lot of my research since then.
Okay. Now, is Arkansas home for you?
No, I'm from North Carolina originally. I've lived all over the place: Michigan, Boston, Virginia, Arkansas.
Well, Michigan's okay. I'm from Michigan, so.
It is.
So as we said a little bit before, that your research focuses on policies affecting educational equity and opportunity. So what does that look like in the K-12 schools? Because you worked in the K-12 schools.
Sure. So I mentioned a couple of these things in the previous question, issues related to equity when it comes to student discipline or access to advanced coursework, whether that's gifted and talented identification or AP course placement, because these things really do translate also into your opportunities to learn, your opportunities to get into higher education institutions. These things have kind of lasting impacts. And so with my research in particular, like I said, a lot of it has focused on student discipline. And there, for example, in Arkansas, I was finding that and this is work with one of my colleagues, Gary Ritter, who's actually now at St. Louis University. We were finding that a lot of the reason for the disproportionalities in student discipline there, because to a certain extent, schools are still fairly segregated. And so just by Black students are much more likely to attend a high discipline school, meaning one that tends to give out longer exclusionary consequences for a given type of infraction. A Black student's more likely to attend one of those types of schools just because they're also more likely to attend a school that serves a higher proportion of Black students. And so some of our work just trying to figure out what are the potential policy levers there. And unfortunately, I think a lot of these policies are really connected, but it's a function also of just what school students are assigned to. And similarly, I've been really interested too in how policies are implemented at that local level and whether that implementation is equitable. I think, Arkansas passed a very well-intended policy to ban out-of-school suspensions for truancy, but it turns out.
What year was that?
Sorry?
What year was that?
In 2013. And so this was a pretty well-intentioned policy with the doesn't make sense to suspend students for not coming to school, sort of contradictory. I've heard one person refer to this as, I think it was a policymaker in Ohio referred to this as, when a student doesn't want to eat broccoli, the punishment is like making them not eat broccoli for the rest of their life. It's sort of counterintuitive response. So it's a well-intended policy. However, when I looked at the compliance at the school level, it was clear that schools that were already more disadvantaged had a harder time complying with it. And so there's an equity issue even in the implementation of, like I said, well-intended policies. So in terms of, my other interest too, equity could be access to effective teachers, and that is related to some of my work that I'm doing in Michigan as well, looking at how quality teachers, measured in a variety of different ways, might be distributed across different types of schools, whether they're charter schools or traditional public schools, and then how potentially the growth of charter schools or interdistrict choice might be affecting that distribution of teacher quality as well. And these things are really important given that charter schools serve a disproportionate amount of students of color and low-income students. They're also more likely to have less experienced, lower quality teachers. And charter schools themselves tend to have less experienced teachers who might also not come from a traditional training program. So just trying to understand how all of those things interact and what that means for students.
Now, along those lines, how do you define high-quality teachers and effective K-12 schools?
Sure. So personally, for me, I would like to define an effective teacher as one who is able to bring students to achieve, like all students from all backgrounds, to achieve at high levels. Similarly, you could say the same thing about what an effective school means. So that means that the expectations for students should not be related to race or income or zip code or their parents' education or anything like that. And it's not enough to just have high expectations for all students, but also to figure out what might be holding certain students back and help address those inequities. Of course, when you're talking about research, it's hard to measure that often. And so we often rely on other things like teaching experience, because there is evidence that teachers become more effective with more experience. Similarly, some researchers use value-added models that try to capture the teacher or the school's contribution to student learning. And of course, these are imperfect measures, but they're observable, and so often we have to rely on those types of things as proxies for what we're trying to capture with teacher quality.
Right. Okay. Great.
And so how can you help us understand how policies related to school choice and teacher labor market reforms influence students' access to high-quality teachers and schools?
Sure. So with respect to teacher policies, recently, within the past decade or so, many states have implemented teacher evaluation policies. I think it's about 44, 45 now, often tied to student achievement. Many have limited tenure or delayed time to tenure or tied tenure to teaching effectiveness. A handful of states have also tried to restrict collective bargaining or union strength in different ways. And while a lot of these types of policies viewed by some as really taking away teachers' autonomy or being a tax on teachers, at the heart of, at least in part, some of these policies are designed to improve teaching quality and then ultimately student achievement, with the idea that prior to some of these policies, it's hard to identify who the good teachers are, it's hard to remove the low performing ones, and it's hard to reward or reward the high performing ones. And teacher evaluation policies have been associated with increases in student achievement. So for example, in DC, the DC Impact, those policies both led to voluntary attrition of lower performing teachers, but also helped improve the teaching practices of the teachers that did remain. But with respect to equity, I think it's important to note too that the implementation of that is important. So for example, in Chicago, where they implemented some teacher evaluation policies, it turned out that the schools that benefited the most were already more advantaged. And so if well-intended policies aren't actually having the intended outcomes, we need to sort of measure and address that. And I think that's where the equity piece really comes in there. So that was more on the teacher side. With respect to school choice, again, I kind of mentioned previously that charter schools, for example, are serving a disproportionate amount of students of color and low-income students. And while they've been shown in some places to be particularly effective for those groups of students, it's also important to compare, to think about how that might influence their access to different types of teachers and ultimately longer-term outcomes. And it's hard to paint a broad brush with school choice policies in general. There's a wide variety of things. So, 43 states plus DC have charter schools, but the legislation varies widely state to state. What that looks like, many states will have inter-district school choice. Some districts will have within-district school choice. And so with this variety of different policies, it's really important to ask equity questions around which types of choice and under what policy or in what policy context is it improving equity? In what context might these policies be exacerbating segregation? Who's actually able to use and access these choices? And then ultimately, do those choices lead to better outcomes? So there's a wide variety of different things that could be studied, and a lot of questions that are more than just, is choice working, but also like, who is it working for, in what contexts, and under what situations. So,
Dr. Anderson, as you were, explaining to us here, that last response, it drives me to the next question. And in K-12, well, in ed leadership also, in general, the idea of theory to practice always comes up, research to practice. So you made me think about this idea of policy versus practice.
Sure.
And I'm sure there's a bit of a divide between policymakers and folks on the ground at the school level, at the classroom level, actually sort of, as they would say, sort of doing the work on the front lines. Like you were in schools, I was in schools for a while, also teaching. So what do you suggest to sort of, or how is this issue even examined, and what do you suggest to sort of close that gap between policymakers and individuals working at the school level?
Sure. And I would actually, maybe add one more element into it, if that's okay, because to me, it's also includes researchers as part of that. So if I think about this policy to practice situation, it's almost like a game with a really diverse set of players. And I think part of the problem is that the players don't talk often enough, and when they do, we're talking a different language. And so, to improve that situation, like I said, I think communication is key. So that might mean making sure that you're bringing in various stakeholders when, if you're a researcher, talking to the policymakers and educational leaders about what's important to them, and trying to study those types of things. When you do, provide research findings, making sure that it's in a way that's really relevant to policymakers and school leaders, and I don't mean just summarizing it or distilling it or trying to remove technical jargon. I mean, all of those things are nice, but I really mean trying to translate it into what is really most relevant and actionable for those people. So again, not just summarizing the findings, but trying to translate it into their local context. I think something else on here that I was thinking of earlier.
You also made me think about a bit of a conundrum, though.
Yeah.
And that conundrum might be that for the academy, for the collection of scholars across the globe, we must write in a certain way, essentially for other scholars. And then that usually goes into places that's accessed primarily by scholars, while policymakers might be creating policy within a context of. So you have all these insular conversations that seem to go on. And at the school level, they're teaching kids every day. They're servicing kids. So you actually have, you're right, 3 different conversations happening in 3 separate spaces and very few lines of communication. So I think you're correct on the one hand, but also by the nature of how we have this set up, it's these built-in silos and barriers. So it's hard to get those lines of communication going. So is that just, like I said, I'm just kind of framing that, but is that accurate?
I think that's true. And I think with regard to the incentives for academics, for example, tenure and promotion is often on people's minds. And so when we're thinking about what do we actually want academics to be doing to make an impact in the world, are we designing our tenure and promotion policies in a way that will also reward them for the types of things that might not end up in a peer-reviewed journal, but might be actually creating real change on the ground? So that might be one possibility for sort of improving this gap as well. And certainly there's, organizations like the Chicago Consortium on School Research, which was one of the earliest, or maybe the earliest, research practice partnership. They've been operating and working with Chicago public schools for almost 30 years now, doing really meaningful work that's not, it's not only local and relevant, but it's rigorous and it's also broadly relevant and nationally recognized. And I think we're continuing to see more and more of that. My postdoc was in the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative at Michigan State, and it was in partnership with the state to do really, again, rigorous but actionable and locally relevant policy research. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to continue to do here as I build my network in Lehigh Valley, is find more school districts to do, again, that work that's both locally relevant and rigorous, but also can have a broader impact on a larger scale.
Okay, excellent.
And it's also wonderful about Lehigh too, because we have the opportunity to work with so many districts and it's hands-on, right? So we see the day-to-day experiences and kind of connect that divide and interact with those silos. So we're talking about on the ground with educators and districts. What can school leaders do to promote educational equity in their school? Sure.
So again, talking about this sort of research practice divide, I think more educational leaders also need to be doing their own research, using data to really understand issues of equity in their school, build awareness in their school. I think that it's also really important to build buy-in at all levels of the district. So it's not enough to just, as a leader, be identifying problems and then communicating that out and hoping for the best. It might take time to really build a team that's also committed to equity to get those efforts off the ground. So it's not a quick fix necessarily, but I think certainly using data, identifying key issues, building awareness and buy-in across the entire organization is really key. Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, this particular program also serves as a vehicle to connect sort of that theory to practice sort of divide in various kinds of ways. What are your suggestions for new directions in the research with regard to educational policy?
Yeah, so I think that, education policy research is in a great place right now. There's the availability of great administrative data, state longitudinal data systems, for example, is a great opportunity to do research. I think I'm seeing a lot more explicit focus on equity in the research too, and so I'd like to kind of continue to see that going. I think certainly what we need more of, and this is something that I'm actively working on, is trying to move my research from just documenting disparities, documenting disproportionalities, to really identifying, okay, what are the potential solutions and how do we provide rigorous evidence on this? So an important example is, if we're limiting suspensions and expulsions, we still need to know more about what the alternatives are and which approaches are going to be most effective under what kinds of contexts and which types of schools with which types of students. And so that's definitely a continuing need. I think similarly, there's a continuing need to just inform some of these sort of hotly debated issues around school choice, for example, or these teacher labor market reforms. Because while they're really important, I think there's still a lot of kind of, like I said, hotly debated questions there. And we need to be making sure that we're asking the right questions and also focusing those questions on students' needs as well, and ultimately their longer term outcomes. So I certainly think that those are important directions for continued research. And like I mentioned as well, I think I'm seeing growth in these sort of research practice partnership type models. And I think that I'm hoping and expecting that will continue as well. The idea that researchers should be working either with a school district or an entire state to really be answering the right types of questions.
Great.
And then our final question today, what do you see as the greatest problem facing American K-12 education?
An easy one.
Yeah,
Easy question.
So I think the major problem I see is both, widespread poverty and childhood trauma, but then also I'm really concerned about stagnation or sticking to the status quo with respect to that. 13 million children in U.S. live in poverty, or about 1 in 5 kids. Some estimates say, I think, about 1 in 4 students will have some sort of traumatic childhood event by the time they're 16. Other estimates put it more at 1/2 of students. And so when you think about these types of large issues, just trying to tinker around the edges or kind of continue to do things the way that we always have isn't enough. And so I think the problem and the challenge combined is that, I think schools and school districts are being asked to do more with less. We've got these issues of, like I said, poverty, childhood trauma, and while that call is certainly important, I think it also requires us to think more boldly about what we do as educators.
Do you have any other any final thoughts, reflections, maybe new directions for your own? Like I said, you talked a little bit about your own research. Are there current projects that you're working on right now?
Sure. So like I said, I think data use in schools is really important. So one of the things I would hope to do before too long is find a school district that would be interested in designing an intervention to help teachers use their own data to understand their own discipline practices or their own classroom management practices, and thinking about the equity implications of that. I think building awareness around issues like implicit bias, and also just providing teachers with their own data on their discipline practices could actually open up their eyes and perhaps encourage them to change. And I'm coming from somebody who, as a teacher myself, I was not the perfect classroom manager, and so this is also coming from a place where I wish that I had more opportunity to both observe and study and improve those practices, and some of my current work as well, I'm looking at the implementation of a law in Arkansas that was limiting suspensions for kindergartners through 5th graders, but trying to understand how principals and also school counselors in the school are interpreting how that implementation is going, and then also looking at how that translates into actual outcomes in the school.
Wow. Okay. Good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, Tashina?
Thank you for being here today. We're
Thanks
so
for having
excited
me.
to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. And also, folks, thank you for joining us today. Again, Dr. Kaitlin Anderson, new faculty member, assistant professor here, Lehigh University Educational Leadership Program. So when you're thinking about coming back and getting that master's degree or that doctorate degree or certifications, make sure you keep in mind Lehigh University. We certainly have new folks here. We've been here for a long time, and we will continue to serve the community. So thank you for joining us. And be sure to join us next month, when our guest will be up. I never tell you that. You'll have to tune in, but we will have another great guest. We'll have another great time here on Education for the 21st Century. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.